The old man had not spoken a single word in 11 years. Doctors called it selective mutism. His son called it a curse. Every servant inside the Belandi mansion had been warned never to sing, never to hum, never to make a sound near his door. So when the new maid, a curvy woman named Livia Serrano, knelt beside his bed one quiet Tuesday morning with a folded linen in her arms, and softly began a lullaby her foster mother had taught her as a small child, no one in that house imagined what would happen next. The Sicilian words drifted through the sunlit room like slow smoke. The old patriarch's hand shot out from under the plaid blanket and seized her wrist. His cracked voice, dry as gravel scraped across dry stone, spoke the first full sentence he had produced in over a decade. "Livia Serrano, your mother is alive." Livia went still. The linen slipped from her hands and fell in a soft white heap on the marble floor between her knees and his slippers. Her wrist was thin inside his shaking grip, and yet the old man clung to it like she was the last rope on the last cliff of a burning house. She had not told anyone her full name inside this mansion. On her paperwork she was listed only as El Serrano. The lullaby was in a language she had not sung out loud in 24 years, since the night her father was murdered and her mother vanished into thin air. Somewhere down the long marble corridor, boots were already moving. A shout, a door slamming. The old man's grip tightened, and his black eyes searched hers as if he were memorizing every line of her face before the light was taken from him again. "Sing it again," he whispered, "before he comes. Sing it before Carlo hears you." Then his eyes rolled back and he sagged against the pillows, exhausted from one single sentence he had held prisoner in his mouth for 11 long years. 3 weeks earlier, Livia had never heard of the Belandi family. She was 33, living in a cramped South Philadelphia walk-up above a bakery, working double shifts at a nursing home to keep her landlord from changing the locks on her apartment door. When the placement agency called her about a live-in domestic job in Chestnut Hill offering triple her hourly rate, she had almost hung up. Triple pay in this city meant one of two things. Either the family was cruel, or the family was dangerous. The recruiter, a nervous woman with a chipped front tooth, admitted quietly that the last 3 maids had quit inside a month. One had left in an ambulance. Livia took the job anyway. She had been a foster child since she was 9 years old, bounced between 6 families across Pennsylvania, and she had learned very young that danger was often cheaper than hunger, and that hunger had claws of its own. She packed one suitcase, one framed picture of a woman she barely remembered, and a small, worn lullaby book. The Belandi driver picked her up in a black car with tinted windows and drove her through wrought iron gates into a world that smelled like cut grass, wet stone, and old money. The mansion rose out of the trees, 3 stories of pale limestone, its windows watching her like the patient eyes of a sleeping animal. She stepped out onto the gravel and felt the whole shape of her life shift a 1/4 inch to the left, though she did not yet know why. She only knew her hands were suddenly cold. Dante Belandi met her in the foyer. He was 51, tall, gray at the temples, and dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him the way armor fits a soldier who has never taken it off. His handshake was brief and cold. He did not smile. He told her 3 rules in a voice as flat as a locked door. Never enter the West Wing without permission. Never repeat anything she saw or heard. Never, under any circumstance, sing, hum, or play music inside his father's room. His father, Salvatore Belandi, he explained, had not spoken since the night his youngest son, Marco, was murdered 11 years ago at a warehouse on the Delaware River. Music, Dante said, made him worse. Livia nodded and asked no questions. She was already counting the paychecks in her head. She was already counting the months until she might sleep through a whole night without listening for the sound of an eviction notice sliding under her door. She agreed to everything. By the end of her first week, she understood why the other maids had run. The mansion was full of eyes, guards at every stair landing, cameras in every hallway. A silver-haired old man in a wheelchair drifted through the halls like a phantom in expensive slippers, watching every move with a warm smile that never reached his eyes. That was Carlo Belandi, Dante's uncle and senior advisor, a man everyone in the house called Zio. He asked Livia her full name 3 times in 3 different ways during her first 3 days. Each time he asked, something cold moved behind his teeth, though his mouth kept smiling. He asked where she had grown up. He asked her mother's maiden name. He asked whether she had brothers or sisters. She answered him truthfully, because a lie inside that house would have been sniffed out inside an hour. She was a foster child. She had no siblings. Her mother's maiden name, she said, she did not know. Carlo patted her shoulder gently and murmured that the Lord looked after orphans. She marked him, in her mind, as someone to avoid. Salvatore was the one nobody spoke to. Dante entered his room twice a day and left within minutes. Nurses came in shifts. Meals arrived on trays and left half-eaten. He sat in a mahogany chair by the window, a plaid blanket over his knees, a mostly untouched glass of water on his side table. His hair was still thick and white. His shoulders had once been broad, but his mouth had been shut for so long that his lips had cracked at the corners, and his throat sounded, when he coughed at night, like paper crumbling. On her 12th morning inside the house, Livia lingered inside his room longer than her orders allowed. It was raining, a gray Philadelphia rain that softened all the sharp edges of the world outside. The nurse had stepped out for coffee. Salvatore was awake, staring at a small carved music box on his dresser, a box so old the varnish had cracked along the seams. Livia recognized the carving on the lid without knowing why. A tiny olive branch bent over a tiny stone bridge. Her chest tightened around a memory she could not fully see. Her foster mother had drawn that exact picture on the inside cover of a battered lullaby book she had kept under Livia's pillow when she was small, the only object Livia had ever refused to leave behind between placements. She began to sing without deciding to. The words came slowly at first, half Sicilian and half Spanish, the way her father used to sing them before he was killed. Livia, Livia, dove sei, mia stellina? Livia, Livia, where are you, my little star? The old man's head turned toward her. His hand rose from his lap, as if it belonged to someone else. He gripped her wrist. He spoke. Your mother is alive. And then he collapsed backward into his pillows and would not speak again for many hours, no matter what Dante Bellondi would demand of him. Livia sat on the edge of the bed with her wrist throbbing and her heart thudding against her ribs like a fist against a locked door. She heard the footsteps in the corridor. She heard Dante's voice, low and sharp, ordering the hall to be cleared. If this opening has already caught you, do the show a small favor and tap the like button and subscribe. There is a great deal more that a curvy maid, a silent patriarch, and one Sicilian lullaby are about to shake loose inside the Bellondi mansion. And you will not want to miss what Carlo Bellondi does when he realizes the girl kneeling in his brother's bedroom is the daughter of the man he murdered 24 years ago behind a South Philadelphia laundromat. Dante found her 10 minutes later, standing in the hallway outside his father's door with wet cheeks and a wrist already bruising into a purple bracelet in the shape of an old man's fingers. The 2 guards behind him had their hands inside their jackets. Dante's voice was very quiet, which she would learn was worse than his shouting. He asked her what she had done. She told him the truth. She had sung a lullaby, and his father had said her full name, and had said her mother was alive. Dante's face did not change, but something behind his eyes moved the way a lion moves before it charges. He ordered the mansion locked down. The gates were closed. Every phone was collected. Every servant was searched. Livia was walked into a windowless study on the ground floor and made to sit in a leather chair while Dante and 2 of his captains stood over her. He asked who had sent her. She said no one. He asked who paid her. She named the placement agency and she gave the amount to the exact dollar. He asked how his father knew her name. She said she did not know, and she was telling the truth, and her voice never once climbed above steady. She had spent her whole childhood being interrogated by caseworkers who assumed foster kids lied by reflex. Dante Bellondi was frightening, but he was not new. She kept her hands folded on the table because folded hands did not shake, and she kept her eyes on the small scratch in the wood between them, because the scratch was easier to look at than his mouth. He noticed. His questions slowed. He sat down across from her and set his own hands flat on the table. You did not flinch when I raised my voice, he said, almost curious now. You did not beg. You did not cry until you were alone in the hallway. Every planted spy I have ever met cried on cue. He looked at her for a long moment. Tell me why I should not throw you in the Schuylkill River tonight and be done with the problem you have handed me. She looked back at him. Because if you throw me in the Schuylkill River tonight, she said evenly, you will never learn how a man who has not spoken in 11 years knew my full name before I ever knocked on your front door. And whoever taught him my name is still living inside your house. Dante was silent for a long moment. Then he told his captains to leave the room. He kept her under guard for 2 more days inside a locked guest suite, but her tray came 3 times a day. On the 3rd morning, Dante himself brought her breakfast. He set the tray down and said, My father took 2 of his pills this morning. He usually takes 6. Livia looked at him. 6 pills, she said carefully, was a great deal of medication for a man whose chart she had read on her first day. A man with mild hypertension and moderate anxiety should not be on 6 daily pills, half of them sedatives strong enough to blunt his speech and dull the memory of a much younger man than Salvatore Belandi. Dante nodded once, slowly, as if a small hidden door had opened inside his mind. He asked her who had chosen the medication. She said the household would know. He said only one person had ever chosen his father's doctors, ever picked his father's pharmacy, ever handled his father's prescriptions, his Uncle Carlo. That evening, Dante took her to his father's room himself. He locked the door behind them from the inside. Salvatore was awake, clearer-eyed than she had ever seen him, and when Dante quietly said, Papa, tell me, the old man began to whisper, not sentences at first, just single words. Livia, Raphael, Isabella, Marco, Ledger. He pointed a shaking finger at the music box on the dresser. Dante lifted it, and it rattled with something more than an old melody. Inside the false bottom, beneath the tarnished silver comb, they found a folded photograph, brittle at the corners. In it stood 2 young men in dark suits with their arms around a young woman with black hair pinned up in a knot. On the back, in careful blue ink, was written a single line. The line read, Raphael and Isabella Serrano with Salvatore and Marco, spring of 1998. Livia sat down on the edge of the bed and put her hand over her mouth. She had never owned a single photograph of her parents in her whole life. The woman in the picture had her exact eyes. The man in the picture had her exact stubborn chin. Dante watched her without a word. When she finally looked up at him, she said quietly, Who was my father to you? Salvatore's cracked voice answered before Dante could. Your father kept my books. Your father found the missing money. Your father is why my son Marco died. And your father is why I stopped speaking. His mouth trembled around the words like a man tasting them for the first time. Because Carlo said at Marco's funeral that if I ever named him out loud, he would kill your mother next, and then he would find you, wherever the state had hidden you, and he would kill you last. And so, God forgive me, I chose you both over my own voice. Livia did not cry. She had learned very young that tears were a currency she could not afford in front of powerful men. Instead, she asked one question. Is my mother truly alive? Salvatore said yes. He had helped Isabella escape the night Raphael was murdered. He had sent her north, then east, and had not spoken her name aloud since. He did not know exactly where she had ended up, but the last envelope of money he had quietly sent through a trusted priest had gone to a small address in Wilmington, Delaware, 7 Christmases ago. Then he lay back, gray with the effort, and Dante led Livia out into the hall. He told the guards that from that hour forward, no pill went into his father's mouth unless Livia herself measured it. 2 mornings later, Carlo Belandi made his move. He came to Dante at breakfast, his face full of paternal concern, and said that $50,000 was missing from the household safe. He said he had watched the tapes. He said the new maid had been alone in the study late on Tuesday night. Dante said nothing. He set down his coffee. He walked upstairs, and inside the small drawer of Livia's borrowed nightstand, tucked under a folded scarf she had never seen before in her life, sat a thick brick of $100 bills bound in a fresh paper strap. Carlo's eyes glittered. He waited for Dante to give the order that would remove the girl from the mansion forever. Instead, Dante turned the money over in his hands and asked Carlo calmly from which account it had come. Carlo said the household safe. Dante said the household safe held old bills only. These bills were freshly minted, sequential, and stamped with a bank strap dated last Tuesday. Dante asked which Belandi account had drawn a bundle like that. Carlo's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His hand tightened on the arm of his chair. Livia stepped into the room. She had spent the last 2 nights inside the study reading through household ledgers Dante had given her, and she had a small notebook in her hand. She said, very softly, that account 4471 had wired $50,000 last Tuesday. She added that account 4471 had only 2 authorized signatures on it, both of them belonging to Carlo Belandi. She turned the notebook toward him. Carlo's face went the color of old milk. He tried to laugh. Dante did not. That evening, in front of every captain seated around the long walnut table in the dining hall, Dante placed Livia in the chair on his right, the chair no one had used since Marco died 11 years ago. He said, without raising his voice, that the woman beside him spoke for him now, on any matter concerning the house. Any man who touched her, questioned her, or raised his voice at her would answer to Dante personally. Carlo smiled and clapped politely with the others around the table, but his eyes did not blink for a very long moment. Take 1 minute right here and let me know in the comments. If you were Livia, sitting for the first time in a dead man's chair at a table full of killers who had watched you serve them dinner 3 nights before, would you have stayed inside that mansion another night? Or would you have taken your paycheck and run? Over the next week, Dante and Livia became something the mansion had never seen. He was still the boss. She was still, on paper, the maid. But she moved through the house with a small leather notebook and a set of keys, and she read every account book that Carlo had ever touched over 24 years of quiet control. Salvatore's speech grew stronger as the sedative slowly left his blood. He began to eat again. He asked for the window to be opened. He asked for the radio to be turned on. He asked for a bowl of olives. Once, when Livia brought him tea, he took her hand across the tray and said, "You look like your father when he was angry. He was almost always angry. He was almost always right about the numbers." She laughed softly, and Salvatore laughed too, a rough sound that had not lived in his throat in over a decade. She sat with him for an hour that afternoon and listened while he told her the color of her father's tie on the day Rafael Serrano was hired. Blue, with small white ships. Rafael had been proud of that tie. The pieces began to fit. Salvatore told them, in slow, careful sessions over 3 long nights, the whole shape of it. 24 years ago, Rafael Serrano, a quiet accountant who lived above a laundromat on 9th Street, had noticed that a certain percentage of dock revenue was disappearing every month into an offshore account no one on the family ledger had authorized. Rafael had brought the discovery to Salvatore in a plain manila envelope. Salvatore had confronted Carlo. Carlo had smiled, denied everything with tears in his eyes, and 2 nights later Rafael had been found dead. Isabella and 9-year-old Livia had been hidden in a church basement while Salvatore made quiet arrangements. Isabella had been smuggled out of Pennsylvania under a false name. Livia had been surrendered to the state foster system on purpose, because Carlo's men were watching every private hand that might have taken her in. Salvatore had lost track of the little girl on purpose, so that Carlo could never find her file. He had prayed for her, quietly, every night for 24 years, and had never once let her name pass his lips. 11 years later, Marco, the younger Belandi son, had begun asking his own questions. He had found Rafael's original ledger inside an old lockbox in the basement, and had started to trace the same offshore trail. Carlo had learned. Carlo had arranged a meeting at an abandoned warehouse on the Delaware River, and Carlo had made it look, cleanly, like a rival family had massacred Marco and 4 of his bodyguards. Salvatore had walked into that warehouse a father, and had walked out of it a ghost. He had never really walked out at all. Carlo had leaned close to him at the funeral, in front of the wet flowers and the black umbrellas, and had whispered a single line into his ear. Speak my name and Isabella Serrano and her little girl die the same way, in the same warehouse, and I will make you watch them go. Salvatore had chosen silence, and silence had cost him his second son too, because Dante had blamed a rival family for 11 long years for Marco's death, and had loved his uncle in the meantime, and had let him pour the wine. Dante did not weep when he heard it. Livia had never seen a man work so hard to keep his face completely still. His hands, though, gripped the leather arms of the chair until the seams split under his thumbs. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost calm. I let him kiss my father on the cheek at Christmas dinner. I let him hand me my glass at Marco's wake. I let him hold my hand the night I was crowned his boss. Papa, Papa, why did you not tell me sooner? Salvatore said quietly. You did not know because I did not let you know. Blame me, but do not blame me forever. Now use me. Let me speak in front of the captains before I die. Let me stand up out of this chair one time and be your father again in front of every man who called me weak behind my back. Dante shook his head, once, and reached across and took his father's hand. You will not die from this, Papa. Not from this. You survived 11 silent years for a reason. 2 nights later, Dante had a name and a small brick house on a quiet street in Wilmington. He drove Livia there himself in a plain sedan, no guards, no announcement, no phone. The woman who opened the door was 57, with silver streaks in her black hair and her daughter's exact stubborn chin. Isabella Serrano looked at Livia for a long moment without breathing, and then she reached up and touched the small scar above Livia's eyebrow, a scar Livia had carried since she was 3 years old and had fallen sideways off a kitchen chair. Isabella whispered, "You still have it." And then they held each other in the small doorway, 2 women who had lost 24 years of birthdays and skinned knees and school pictures, while Dante Bellondi stood on the porch and stared very hard at the porch light so he would not have to intrude on the moment. Somewhere down the block, a screen door slammed. A dog barked. Livia felt her mother's shoulders shake against her own, and she realized, with something between grief and joy, that she had a shoulder of her own to lean on now. Isabella confirmed everything. She had a small suitcase under her bed that held Raphael's original ledger, the one that Salvatore had smuggled to her the night she fled, the one that named every account, every signature, every date, every wire. She handed the leather book to Dante with hands that shook only slightly. She said, "If you use this to bring my daughter home to me safely, Mr. Bellondi, I will forgive you your family. If you use it to bury her instead, I will find you myself, and I will bring my father's shotgun." Dante bowed his head. It was an old-world gesture Livia had never seen him give to anyone, and he promised her mother, quietly, that Livia would come home to Wilmington on her own 2 feet, or not at all. On the long drive back to Philadelphia that night, the highway was empty, and the yellow overhead lights ran across the windshield in long, slow bars. Dante was silent for many miles. Then he said, without looking at her, "I have never loved anyone I did not eventually have to bury." She said, "Then let me be the first exception." He glanced at her. She did not smile. She meant it. He pulled the car onto the wide shoulder and set his hand carefully against the side of her face, and he kissed her once, briefly, the way a man kisses when he is not entirely sure he is allowed to. She did not pull back. She only rested her forehead against his for a long moment, listening to the faint tick of the engine cooling, and then she said, softly, "Drive. Carlo will already know we went to Wilmington. He always knows." Carlo did know, but he was not waiting the way they expected him to. When they returned to the mansion 2 hours before dawn, the west wing was empty. Salvatore was gone. His wheelchair sat askew in the middle of the room. His plaid blanket lay crumpled on the floor. A single silver comb from the music box had been placed carefully, almost ceremoniously, in the center of his pillow. Livia saw it and understood at once. Carlo did not want a small, quiet fight in the corridors. Carlo wanted a stage, and witnesses. Dante's phone rang before he could finish the thought. Carlo's voice, warm and grandfatherly as ever, told him to come alone to the abandoned Delaware River warehouse, where Marco had died 11 years ago. He told him to bring the ledger. He told him he had 50 minutes. He told him that if he was late by a single one of those minutes, Salvatore Bellondi would die in the very same corner where his younger son had died, and there would be no funeral this time, only a river. The line went dead in Dante's ear. Dante set the phone down and looked at Livia across the room. He said, "Stay here in the mansion, please." Livia said, "No." He said, "Livia." She said, "He took my father from me before I could remember his voice. He took 24 years of my mother's kitchen from me. He will not take another person from me while I stand in a hallway waiting for a phone call." Dante closed his eyes for one long second, as if he were memorizing the sound of her voice, and then he nodded once, and they moved. The warehouse smelled of river water, rust, and old blood that had never quite been scrubbed out of the concrete, no matter how many winters had passed. Carlo had lit it with 4 standing work lamps, harsh and yellow and unforgiving. He had called the captains. 12 men in dark coats stood along the walls with their hands folded in front of them, uncertain, watching. Salvatore sat in a wooden chair at the head of the long room, upright, unbound, his white hair combed neatly. Carlo had wanted him seen. Carlo wanted the last dignity stripped from him in public. Carlo stood beside him, one hand resting almost tenderly on the old man's shoulder, a pistol tucked into his waistband. 2 of his own loyal gunmen stood behind him with their arms crossed. Dante walked in alone, or so it seemed to every eye in the room, carrying a leather satchel. He set the satchel on a battered metal table in the center of the concrete floor and unbuckled it slowly, one strap at a time. Carlo smiled. Dante did not. The lamps hummed. Somewhere outside, a foghorn on the river gave one long, low complaint. Carlo spoke first, as he had always preferred to. He said, in front of the captains, that his nephew had grown weak because of a maid and a broken old man. He said the ledger inside Dante's satchel was proof of nothing, because the Bellondi accounts were his to interpret, as they had always been, since before Dante was old enough to shave. He said Dante was here tonight to hand over the docks and kneel, so the family could survive the shame the boy had brought into the house. He opened his arms invitingly. Dante did not kneel. Instead, he asked one question, and he asked it not of Carlo but of Salvatore, sitting behind him. "Papa, in front of every captain in this room, who murdered my brother Marco?" The room held its breath. The nearest captain shifted his weight, once. Salvatore stood. It took him a long moment because his legs had not been asked to hold his full weight in years, and the muscles remembered the ask slowly. But he stood. He straightened his shoulders. His voice, when it came, was cracked, but it carried across the concrete like a bell. "My brother Carlo Bellondi murdered my son Marco. My brother Carlo Bellondi murdered Rafael Serrano before him, 24 years ago, in an alley behind a laundromat, over 3 bullets and 1 honest ledger. My brother Carlo Bellondi has stolen from this family every month for 24 years and has smiled at me across every Sunday dinner. And I, coward that I was, kept his secret to save 1 child of an accountant. That child stands beside my son tonight, and I will not keep her a secret 1 more hour." Carlo drew the pistol from his waistband. He aimed it unbelievably at his own brother. He never fired. Livia stepped out of the shadows near the loading tunnel, and in her hand she held not a weapon but a small phone. She said evenly, "The original ledger my mother kept for 24 years is already in the hands of a federal attorney in Wilmington, sealed and notarized. Every account, every wire, every signature. What Dante said on that table is a photocopy, Carlo. Kill him. Kill me. Kill Salvatore. The paper walks into a courthouse Monday morning either way." Carlo turned the pistol on her instead. 2 of his own gunmen, hearing Salvatore's voice for the first time in 11 years, hesitated for a full breath. That hesitation was the crack in the door. Dante's men, hidden in the tunnel behind Livia, moved in through the loading door Marco himself had drawn on a warehouse blueprint 11 years ago. That blueprint had been preserved by Salvatore, folded into 8 small squares, inside the false bottom of the same music box that had held the photograph and the lullaby. Everything Marco had left behind had been kept. The fight was brief and ugly. Carlo's two loyal gunmen fell first, cut down before they could raise their weapons above their belts. The captains, most of them, did not raise a hand for Carlo, because a patriarch who has spoken from silence carries a weight even a lifetime of easy smiles cannot outrun. Carlo backed toward the wall and lifted his pistol toward Livia one more time, his hand shaking now. Dante was faster than his uncle had ever imagined he could be. He crossed the concrete in 3 long strides and struck the pistol out of Carlo's hand. He forced Carlo down onto both knees in front of Salvatore's chair. Carlo, red-faced and gasping, tried the very last card he had left. He said, "Dante, nephew, we share blood. Your grandmother's blood. Your father's blood. My blood." Dante looked down at him for a long moment. He did not blink. Then he said very quietly, so quietly that the captains along the wall leaned forward without meaning to, "Blood made you family. Betrayal made you nothing." He fired one shot. Carlo fell forward at Salvatore's feet, and the warehouse was still. If you have made it with us this far, please take 1 second and hit that like button. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, subscribe now, because the ending of Livia Serrano's story is going to sit with you longer than you might expect, and I would like to be able to bring you the next one already waiting for you behind it. Stories like this one, told the way they deserve, are only possible because of you. Salvatore was carried out of the warehouse on his own feet. He would not use a chair for the walk. He put one hand on Dante's forearm and one hand on Livia's shoulder, and he took each step across the concrete on his own 2 legs, past his younger son's dried blood, past the corner where he had lost his voice 11 years ago, and out into the pale gray dawn along the river. The captains who had refused to fire for Carlo walked out behind him with their heads bowed low. The captains who had raised weapons for Carlo did not walk out at all. That was a matter Dante would settle quietly over the following weeks, one man at a time, with the kind of patience his uncle had never had. Isabella Serrano came home to Philadelphia the following Saturday afternoon. She stood in front of every senior captain of the Belandi family in the same walnut dining hall where Livia had once been placed in a dead man's chair. She spoke about her husband Raphael, about the ledger he had died protecting, about the 24 hidden years. When she was finished, no one at the long table spoke for a full minute. Then, one by one, each captain rose to his feet in the old way, without being told to. Salvatore whispered to Livia later that it was the first time in Belandi family history a bookkeeper's widow had been given that particular honor. He said Raphael would have laughed at the ceremony and would have secretly kept the memory of it, folded neatly, for the rest of his life. Livia squeezed his hand across the arm of his chair. Isabella cried quietly beside her. The money and the property Carlo had stolen from Raphael Serrano's estate was returned in full to Livia and to Isabella, tallied on a fresh ledger in Livia's own careful handwriting. Livia did not use it to leave. She used it to open a small, legitimate accounting firm in Center City, hired 2 young women out of the same Pennsylvania foster system she had grown up inside, and put her mother's name on the front window in gold leaf. She still lived in the mansion. She still cleaned Salvatore's music box herself once a week with a soft cotton rag. But she was no longer the maid. She was, in the language the captains had begun to use for her when they thought she could not hear them, La Signora. Several months later, on a warm October evening, the Belandi family gathered around the long walnut table for the first formal dinner since the warehouse night. Salvatore sat at the head, upright, thinner than before but clear-eyed, and he spoke a short blessing over the meal in Sicilian, the language of his mother. Dante sat on his right. Livia sat on Dante's right, in a soft, dark dress. Her own mother sat beside her, hands folded, quietly astonished at the length of the table. Dante stood before the soup was served. He said in a voice that carried down the length of the polished wood without needing to be raised, "Some of you have asked me quietly this week and last what you should call the woman beside me. She is not my maid. She is not my employee. She is not my guest. She is the woman beside me, and she is the last person any of you should ever be tempted to betray." He raised his glass to her, and every captain along the table rose in turn. Livia did not blush. She only reached out under the tablecloth and quietly laced her fingers with his on top of the walnut wood, in front of every one of them, because she had learned in a foster home at 9 years old that love which hides itself is love that eventually runs, and she was done running from the shape of her own life. Isabella looked at her daughter across the candles and smiled, and reached under the table for her hand too. Later that night, after the guests were gone and the house was quiet, Livia sat on the edge of Salvatore's bed and opened the small music box on the dresser. The old melody wound out into the room, thin and sweet and a little out of tune the way it had always been, and she sang along, softly, the same Sicilian Spanish lullaby she had sung the rainy morning the old man broke his 11-year silence. Livia, Livia, dove sei, mia stellina? Livia, Livia, where are you, my little star? Salvatore closed his eyes. He smiled the way a man smiles when he has finally set down a weight he had almost forgotten he was carrying. Dante stepped quietly into the doorway and stood there for a long moment, watching them, and then he crossed the room and set his hand very gently over hers on the coverlet. 3 hands, 3 generations, 1 song, 1 family finally whole. Outside, the wind moved through the tall trees of Chestnut Hill, and inside, for the first time in 11 long years, the Belandi mansion was not afraid of its own silence. If this story moved you the way stories like this one are meant to move us, tell me one thing in the comments before you go tonight. Was it Livia's courage that saved this family in the end? Or was it Salvatore's willingness to finally speak, after 11 years of guarding 2 women he had never met a second time, that mattered most when the warehouse doors opened? I read every answer, honestly, and your voice is the reason I get to sit down and tell the next one waiting behind this.